Hey E36 fanatics, Steven here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to look at common problems with suspensions on BMWs, such as steering wheel vibration, clunking noises coming from the car whenever you're driving it, and other issues associated with suspension issues. And then I'm also going to be showing you how to diagnose these problems. So one of the really easy ways to test out your tie rods and figure out whether or not you got a problem is jack the side up that you think is having an issue, put it under a jack stand obviously, and then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go 3-9 with your hands and side to side. And if you're getting a clunking motion and a lot of movement from side to side, or a little bit, like a decent amount of movement from side to side, that's going to be that's a sign that your inner tie rod has gone out. Your inner tie rod, and I'm going to show you here in a minute, has a ball joint, and I just had to change one on a Z4, so I'm going to show you that and what it really looks like from the inside once they go out. And then another issue sometimes with suspensions are wheel bearings. So a really easy way to test a bad wheel bearing is to just go 12 to 6 and see if there's any movement in the tire that way. There's absolutely none here. These are good wheel bearings. All right, so here I got the wheel off. And the good news about suspensions is that they're really not that complicated. Your biggest part of your front suspension is always going to be your front control arm, which is this part right here. Now this is an older BMW. E36s and E46s, they have a front style control arm like this with two ball joints, one here and then one going into the steering knuckle right down here. And then there is one bushing right over here. So if you have a bad bushing or you have a bad ball joint, you're going to want to go ahead and replace the whole control arm. I always recommend to people to go ahead and do that. On newer BMWs, it's not really an issue because the control arm style is different in the front where you have to replace the whole control arm anyways. But in these older BMWs, you're gonna have the option if you want to just replace the bushing or not. So here are two bad control arms that I'm changing on a Z4 BMW. Essentially the same as the E36 or any other old BMW. So you got your two ball joints right here, and they have a lot of play in them. You see all this play in the joints here, and then this one's really gone. They both have cracks in the joints. So these ball joints are gone on both of these control arms. And then we also have our main control arm bushing, which this one is also shot. So you can see all the wiggle room this thing has, and this one as well. So these are shot control arms, and symptoms you'll get from bad ball joints and bushings: you'll get clunking noises when you brake or when you're driving and turning. You'll get steering wheel vibration, and you'll get wandering on your steering wheel. All these things are possible. When your bushings really go out, you can get some loud clunking noises as well. Another really important component is your sway bar links, which are right here. You have a sway bar link on either end, which is this, which connects to your control arm up to the stabilizer bar / sway bar. And then you have a sway bar bushing right here. Now, when these two go out, they don't actually cause a whole lot of symptoms in terms of drivability, but they will tend to make, when I've seen sway bar links and sway bar bushings go out, they make kind of a clunking noise a little bit, but not a lot of difference in drivability. And when these go out, especially this bushing right here, it tends to crack quite a bit. Now, I replaced this bushing and the link about a year or two ago, so as you can see, this is a good one. There's no cracks on the inside where the sway bar actually goes in. And as you can see on the sway bar link, this thing's brand new. The boot's really nice. There's no movement in the link itself, so these are good, and they're stiff, so we don't have a problem there. Your next big component is your tie rod. Your tie rod's actually two parts. You have an inner tie rod, which is this portion right here, and it bolts into your outer tie rod here. And your inner tie rod actually connects into your steering rack inside of this boot. And your outer tie rod, which is the component that more frequently goes bad, is right here. Right here. Now, as you can see, this outer tie rod has seen better days. It's got a really big gash right here, unfortunately. So this outer tie rod could probably be replaced. This is a really big gash. And this is what happens as they wear. They get these big gashes on them and they become... So this one I can't actually move around with my hand. But when they go really bad, you can actually move around the outer tie rod by hand. Here's a good example of a bad inner tie rod. You see all this movement here? Look at it. Look at that thing. That thing is gone. There's actually a ball joint inside the inner tie rod, and when it goes out, you get this, where there's absolutely no resistance. Now the outer tie rod here, I mean, it's on its way out. I've seen worse, but I'm gonna go ahead and change the whole thing here. Here's your inner tie rod, and to most people it just looks like a metal piece. You're like, what's the problem here? But it actually has a ball joint inside of it that, as you can see, there is a ton of wiggle room on this one. Now look at the new one. None at all. It's extremely stiff. So another thing with your inner tie rod is you don't actually see the ball joint here when you're looking at your inner tie rod because it's inside of a boot, your steering rack boot. And if your steering rack boot is full of liquid, or it's got liquid coming out when you open up the boot, that is symptomatic of a different problem. That is actually going to be your steering rack itself. It has seals on either end of it when it goes into the inner tie rod, and when those seals start to go out, it starts leaking out power steering fluid into the boot, and that's when you'll get a boot full of power steering fluid. Another thing to look out for, which I've had replaced before, is wheel bearings. Your wheel bearings go inside of the hub here. They're basically a bunch of little metal balls that are held together by a ring on either end, and they basically stabilize the wheel to allow the wheel to turn properly. Wheel bearings are really a pain in the ass to replace when they go out. I'm not a big fan of replacing them because, especially the rear ones, because you have the axle, the actual CV axle that's going through, and you have to try and get it through. And after many years of driving on that CV axle, they tend to really get stuck in there. And I think last time I needed a torch to get it out. It's a pain in the ass. So anyways, when wheel bearings go out, you tend to notice when you're turning, you know, you could be turning anywhere from like 10, 20, 30 miles an hour and making a sharp, the sharper the turn is, the more distinct the noise is going to be. It tends to be kind of a clunking sound, but that'll indicate that your wheel bearing is going out. A way to test that, besides just listening to a noise that's being made when you turn, is to take off your brake right here and actually spin the rotor. If it's not spinning freely and you hear a noise coming with the spin, you probably got a bad wheel bearing. So here's something else that I just recently changed on the Z4. It's not really a suspension component, but it can have some similar symptoms to a suspension problem, especially when you're hitting the brakes, and that is your brake rotor. So brake rotors tend to warp as they age. If you don't change them per the BMW's recommended intervals, it'll start to warp and it'll get too thin. And then when you brake, you'll get symptoms like your steering wheel will shake, it might pull to the side when you're braking, and it might even make a loud screeching noise or some kind of noise due to your brake warpage. On this rotor, the rotor was somewhat warped. You can see some deep gashes inside of it. And there's a nice little lip on the brake rotor. So these were probably ready to go, and I went ahead and switched them. And then another common issue with suspensions that you might notice is your struts. The way I think about control arms and tie rod ends is that that's going to cause more side-to-side play. Your struts are often going to cause more vertical play. And especially if you have an older vehicle, like these are E36s, these cars have been old for a long time now. When these struts go out, it really feels like you're on a freaking, like a trampoline or a boat or something like that. When you hit bumps, the car just bounces up and down, up and down. And that's a clear indicator that your struts have gone out. Okay, so here you can see everything that I've done on this BMW Z4 recently. Changed the control arms. These things were out. The ball joints, the bushings were bad. I've changed the inner tie rods, which were also bad. And I ended up changing the brake rotors because one of them was pretty warped and had a nice lip on it, so I ended up changing both of those as well. And the outer tie rods were, they weren't too bad, but I figured we'd go ahead and change them since I was changing the inner tie rods anyways.